We are proud members of the Spy Podcast Network. Find out more at www.spypodcasts.com.
Due to the themes of this podcast, listener discretion is advised.
I don't like indulging in the blood just for the shock value of it. I don't have a lot of fondness for that. And yet we are writing about a very serious topic that has claimed a lot of lives in a lot of very gruesome ways in just the last 10 years, and still does to this day. I mean, the Taliban retaking Afghanistan has been no picnic for anyone involved.
Lock your doors, close the blinds, change your passwords. This is Secrets and Spies. Secrets and Spies is a podcast that dives into the world of espionage, terrorism, geopolitics, and intrigue. This episode is presented by Matt Fulton and produced by Chris Carr.
Hello, and welcome back to the Secrets and Spies podcast. Today we're going to look at a topic that's of interest to many of our listeners, spy fiction. I'm joined by my longtime friend and fellow indie spy writer, Stephen England. He joins us to talk about his decade-long career as an author. We'll be delving into his best-selling Shadow Warriors series, his writing process and influences, and how he draws inspiration from contemporary geopolitics and history. If you've been curious to get a look under the hood at how spy thrillers are made, this conversation is for you. Before we begin, all our episodes are on YouTube, and you can find the link to subscribe to that in the show notes. If you wish to support the podcast, there are a few options for you. You can become a Patreon subscriber and directly support the show for $4 or £3 a month. We also have a merchandise store at Redbubble where you can find cups, coasters, water bottles, and tote bags. If you enjoy this episode, please share it on your social media with friends, family, and the like. And lastly, please do leave a review on your podcast streaming app of choice. Every review juices that algorithm and helps the show get discovered by others. All the relevant links for today will be in the show notes below. Thanks so much for your support. Let's get going.
The opinions expressed by guests on Secrets and Spies do not necessarily represent those of the producers and sponsors of this podcast.
Stephen England. Hey, buddy. Thanks for coming on the pod.
Hey. Oh, thanks for having me, Matt. Good to be here.
Happy to have you. So, for the uninitiated among us, tell us a little bit about you.
Well, I've been an author now for about, I'm thinking now I actually published first book December of 2009, so about 13 years. So it's been quite a ride.
Yeah. So your first book was Nightshade, the novella.
Actually, the first book, which was not connected with any of my other books, was a kind of pseudo historical novel called Sword of Naamha. It was set ancient history, so forth. But I really got into the Shadow Warriors. Series with Pandora's Grave in 2011, and then released Nightshade as part of an anthology in, I think, either late 2012 or early 2013. And then kind of once I released it, there was kind of this window where it kind of had a bit of exclusivity to the anthology, and then once I released it on my own, I kind of ended up moving it to the front of the series because it was a nice kind of intro for readers, a little bit of a taste of everything they could expect from a full-length novel. So
right.
So yeah, that was the progression there.
So I guess starting with Pandora's Grave, right, which is sort of where the Shadow Warrior series, which is your sort of big, landmark thing that you've been working on for the last over a decade. Starting with that and the introduction of Harry Nichols sort of around that time. I mean, you put out Pandora's Grave, you were in your early 20s. I mean, that's very early for anyone to publish. So I guess talk us through the road to putting out that first novel.
Well, I actually had been working with, I'd actually been working with Nichols for even longer. I've probably been working with Nichols since, I was probably in my mid-teens, really, and we'll get into that a little bit later in the show because it plays into some of the questions we were discussing the other day. But I really, when I came back to Pandora's Grave and wrote that story as very much his origin story, I very much wanted to. So many stories in the genre. It's not quite as exclusive now, but it was more true back then. We're very much focused on kind of the lone wolf type of character. And as someone who was kind of interested in the real world backing of a lot of the genre, I found that kind of interesting because if you look at SEALs, if you look at Delta Force, if you look at any number of these elite units that often form the backdrop for protagonists in the genre, they are not geared to producing guys who are just running off and doing things on their own.
Right.
And so I kind of wanted to look at, I wasn't opposed to going down the Singleton route, but I kind of wanted to take a look at how would someone get there. And Pandora's Grave and then Day of Reckoning really become the story of how Nichols goes from being not just a team player, but actually a team leader, to being someone who's very much out in the cold and on his own, operating with no safety net, no backing, no network. And there's moments in the series as the books progress where you start to see some of the flaws of that. He makes... We've had a number of conversations about this in the past, of course, but he makes some very serious errors in later books because he's out on his own. He knows only what he knows and doesn't have that backing of an agency, of an intelligence support network. And so it's kind of, in some ways, a bit of a deconstruction of the omniscient superhero type portrayal in the genre, because he's good. There's never any real question that he's good, but he is not anywhere near invincible, and he's not always right in what he determines by himself either.
Yeah, I mean, something that really has sort of made your book stand apart is I think the kind of nuance and the depth that these stories show, and your willingness to have your protagonist and your other characters sort of walk on that gray area and not be so perfect, like you're going to hand them a Glock and they're just going to go off and just fix this big issue. Do you think it's important to portray that in the genre?
I think so. I mean, for one reason, I think it creates a lot more relatability in the character because they're more human in that sense. I mean, we all make mistakes. We've all gone into a situation and realized, man, I really screwed that up. I didn't handle that right. Or wow, if I had known. I mean, even if you're not behaving recklessly, all of us have known situations that we've gone into and we've walked back out of it and found out something later, like an hour later, that we're like, if I had known that about that person or that situation, where I would have handled that totally differently.
Yeah.
And I think we can all relate to that. And then I think it's also a bit of the way the genre has kind of taken its own twists and turns in the particularly past decade and a half, realizing that what we all wanted to believe in the years immediately succeeding 9/11, that the U.S. was going to go get the bad guys, go get the job done, and everything was going to be just peachy. Well, I mean, we're sitting here today, and the Taliban's back in power in Afghanistan. Something went wrong somewhere, many places.
Yeah,
and clearly, even those that go in with the best of intentions don't always know where their actions will lead. And so I think that's an important balance to bring into the genre. Not necessarily, I've also, the genre often has gone, I think, one of two ways. Either kind of the infallible, all-American, patriotic superhero, or the Snowden side of things, where the government is evil, and this lone hero is going to bring down the evil within the government. And I think the Shadow Warriors series really kind of threads a middle course and basically says, okay, the road's paved with good intentions, but it may well be going to hell. And
that's a good quote. Yeah.
I mean, in some ways, I think I may sometimes give the characters in the books and the roles and they play maybe a little bit too much of a benefit of a doubt in terms of what their motives are and the purity of their intentions. But I do think it's interesting to explore that in the sense of we can have the best of intentions and things can still go completely pear-shaped in a heartbeat. I think one of the best examples of that, and there are quite a few, but probably one of the best examples of that in the Shadow Warriors is the shorter novel Quicksand I wrote a few years back, which is basically a bit of a deconstruction of a drone strike. And they go through endless hoops trying to make sure this drone strike only kills the people they intended to kill. It doesn't claim innocent lives, and things still end up completely spiraling out of control with results that none of them could have anticipated when they finally give the order to fire. And it's just, I think that's an important perspective to bring in, particularly in these later years of the global war on terror, as it becomes more and more clear that things did not go as planned.
Yeah. I want to put a pin in that because you're sort of, I think, touching around the edge of a subject that I would love to get into with you in a bit about like the ethics of writing in the spy genre. But before we get there, I wanted to sort of go back to, I guess, your earliest thought, wherever that was, that you wanted to be a writer and you wanted to write about, spy fiction, geopolitical issues. Where did that start for you?
Oh, that's going way back. That's going way back in the midst of time.
Yeah. Well, we sort of came of age, I think, at the same. I mean, we were born like a week apart from each other, so we came of age at the same time. With 9/11, with the global war on terror, and I know for me, like it was being exposed to that, and then being introduced to Clancy, specifically the Sum of All Fears, and then John le Carré came along, and the rest was history. So, what was that sort of journey like for you?
Well, I think I'd always had a fascination with reading. I've always been a voracious reader. And really, I think starting into my teens, I really started getting some exposure to the thriller genre. Ironically, though, I don't think this will surprise too many of my readers of Pandora's Grave, but ironically, my first real exposure to the thriller genre was through Clive Cussler.
Okay, yeah.
He was very much a different flavor of the thriller genre. Very much more escapist action, and not really a lot of real world scenarios or consequences or whatever else you might say. Incredible storyteller. His books are a heck of a read. But I really was introduced to the genre through him, and then discovered Clancy. And Clancy was where my lifelong fascination with military gadgets and gear and all the stuff really met fiction. I was like, oh, I love this. His characters are pretty amazing, and his knowledge of the military is something else, and I love this guy. And so I started reading him quite voraciously, and pretty sure I've probably read most everything he ever wrote. At least everything that he ever wrote. But that
we'll get to that a bit.
But that was kind of my introduction to the genre, and I really came to some of the other authors in the genre much later in the process, but really had kind of figured out what I wanted to write largely from those two and a few others. I mean, Clancy had a lot of imitators in the 90s. I read. Yeah. I read a fair number of their books. Nothing ever quite measured up to the OG, but yeah, that was kind of where things got started. And of course, 9/11 had happened by that point in time. The world was shifting in a lot of kind of dramatic ways, and yeah, I mean, we grew up through that. So it was it was very much being exposed to a lot of that environment, and then yet starting to see it. I don't think go off the rails is too harsh of a word. I mean, by the time I was even old enough to join the military, I had people I knew in the military just like, joining up right now isn't a good idea. People don't know what they're doing, and yeah, it was already kind of the inside view of what had happened in Iraq and Afghanistan that was just like, yeah, this is not going the way it was intended to. And yeah, so I think it was a lot of that that exposure really that kind of charted to more or less an extent my own path as I started to get more and more interested in writing the genre, and spent a number of years trying to write books that I would write and then throw away, and write and throw away, and we'll get to more of that later. But it's been an interesting process.
What was your first Clancy novel?
That is a really good question. I think I may have. Well, I remember reading Clear and Present Danger 2 or 3 times and not being able to get into it. I was probably 11 or 12 at the time.
Yeah.
I think the first one I finished was Hunt for Red October.
Okay.
It's possible. Either that or Red Storm Rising. I remember those two were very close together. But I eventually collected them all and read all the original Ryan books. So
yeah, I think that was sort of similar to me. The first one was, I was sort of really into that stuff, and then Some of All Fears, the movie, the Ben Affleck movie came out, and I watched that, and I was like, okay, like this is really cool. I mean, my like 11, 12-year-old brain at the time.
I've never watched that film.
Yeah, it's kind of aged not that great, but anyway, it's not the Harrison Ford ones. But anyway, it was Some of All Fears. I think it was sort of the same thing that you said, that like I had a hard time really getting into it. I think I was just still too young to really tackle it. And then at some point down the road, you're like, okay, I can do this.
They're daunting books at that age.
Oh, I know. They're daunting books now.
Yeah.
I mean, you pick up executive orders and it's like, yeah, well.
You should talk.
I'm trying to write them and it's just as hard as, Anyway, so you said you sort of started a couple projects that sort of fizzled out. You put down, started other things. Can you sort of talk through a little bit about what those projects were, or I guess what you learned in trying to write them and failing, frankly?
Most of them, to be perfectly honest, were Shadow Warriors. They were kind of my attempts to learn what Shadow Warriors was going to be.
Yeah.
I mean, I would say I was also a huge Hardy Boys fan growing up. And so I think the early attempts at writing were very heavily influenced by that, by Clive Cussler, by a lot of the more escapist type work. And really then Pandora's Grave was kind of my attempt to try to say, okay, all that stuff is trash, and it's not going to... I mean, some of the stuff one thing I found early on writing, and I don't know if you would share in this experience, but one thing I found very early on writing is I couldn't sustain a story past like 40, 45 pages.
Yeah, I sort of felt that too.
And of course now I'm looking at like 550 pages or whatever on my screen, and I'm like, you got to cut this down. But at that point in time, I really couldn't sustain a story past 40, 50. I remember the first time I got one to get past 100 pages was just amazing. And I was like, oh, this is actually starting to be an actual book now. And it was kind of that fun moment of discovery, as it were. But yeah, now I've got the opposite problem. But that was really so all those stories. I mean, I had a number of. I think the original first book for Shadow Warriors, it kind of revolved around very much kind of an Indiana Jones, Clive Cussler-esque type treasure in Central America, and it was fun, but it wasn't something that I looked at several years later and was like, oh yes, this could be a key part of this new series. So I kind of had to reinvent the Shadow Warriors series and say, where is it starting now? where do I write this origin story for this character I've now been writing about for already 5 years or so, but I've got to take him back to his origin and kind of reboot this thing, as it were. So yeah,
Right.
that was a good bit of the process there.
Yeah. So you learned the craft of writing by just doing it again and
Pretty
again
much,
and
yeah.
again and again.
Yeah.
Right. I mean, that's sort of how it was for me. I mean, I remember that all my earlier iterations of different works, like what you were saying, they're all just earlier versions of active measures, and a lot of the characters there, Jack is there, Nina's there, Ryan Freeman's there, Kazanov is there.
So you're basically just trying to tell us you've had a twisted mind for a very long time.
I was, yeah. So I started it. I was in the 6th grade. So I was 11. This is like 2001, 2002. And I took yellow loose leaf paper off the shelf in the classroom and just started writing. I still have it. It'll never see the light of day as long as I'm alive, but I still have it.
Writing career begins with active larceny.
Basically, yeah. And you just, like you said, you just kept doing it again and again and again. And I think, would you say, I mean, I like to tell people that I sort of knew what I wanted to do at that age. I just wasn't capable of doing it. And if you took active measures now that I eventually wrote and published and gave it to 6-year-old me, he would say, yeah, that's pretty much what we had in mind. Do you feel that way?
I don't know that I would. I think my concept for the Shadow Warrior series has evolved a lot through the years, even since the publication of Pandora's Grave. I mean,
right.
Kind of the way I've come to look at things. I would say it's changed a lot. I think I definitely, you would have blown me away if you would have told me that I'd sell more than a half dozen of the books.
Yeah.
But yeah, I think it's very much been an evolving process. Yeah, I think that's probably I'd probably have to say that. Very much more of an evolution than a realization of exactly what I wanted to do back then.
So, about when were you done with the first really good draft of Pandora's Grave, and you were like, okay, this is something that's good. Like, I have something here. I can think about putting this out to the world. Like, when was that?
That was, I would say, no, actually, I'd say that was midwinter or so of 2011.
Okay, so you're about 21.
Yeah, so yeah, things progressed pretty much on a straight line from getting done in early 2011 to publishing it in summer of 2011. So
right.
Yeah, it was a pretty straightforward path from that point forward.
You're and I said this in my intro, you're an indie spy writer, so you're self-published like me.
Yeah.
What led you to choose that route over, querying agents and going down the traditional path, or did you try that in some regard?
Right. The very thought of writing query letters scared me to death.
Yeah, same.
I'm not lying. That was a lot of my impetus to just go forward and just throw it out there and see what could happen.
Right.
Which I'd already had a little bit of experience doing that with my prior alternate history novel. So I had some familiarity with that process, and I thought, well, I'll go ahead with this and see what happens. And what happened was it had a fair bit of success, and that kind of inspired me to keep on that path. So
what was that like? I mean, when did you know that this did? I mean, I think I saw on Amazon you have several hundred reviews up there as of right now.
Yeah.
When did you know that like you had something here that it was worthwhile to keep going with this series?
Well, I think my attitude has always been I was going to keep going with the series whether it was worthwhile or not. So
right. Yeah.
But when I think it was probably in the books really I really kind of caught the tail end of the kind of first indie publishing is big wave, and as a result in 2012 Pandora's Grave by itself with pretty much nothing else out there really sold well, and that was really the first external validation of people really like this series, this concept. They're waiting for book 2. Then of course the pressure was on to actually write book 2, which was all kinds of fun.
Right.
But yeah, that was really kind of the first wave, as it were, which had faded somewhat by the time I actually got Day of Reckoning out in late 2013.
Yeah.
But it's still continued to be well received, and I've continued to sluggishly put out books since. I would like my readers to know that this latest book, Soon Dies the Day, the latest entry in the Shadow Warrior series, my 3-day literary operation to finish that book has now been going on for several months. So, but I do want to assure them that I will have the book finished before Putin reaches Kyiv. So it'll be fine.
I feel your pain on that one. So I mean, okay, so let's fast forward for about a decade or so. I mean, you've been doing this for a good solid 10 years. You're up to 11 published entries in the Shadow Warrior series.
Yes,
a couple prequel novellas, a few other sort of projects on the side that you have. So. Yeah. Can you take us through your process? Like, okay, like you just published a book, right? You sit down and you're like, okay, now I got to do something next. Where does that begin for you? Is it like a survey of the world, looking for stuff that interests you, or do you look for inspiration from other writers? How does that work?
Well, I typically have the next book in mind before I finish the one I'm currently working on. When Soon Dies the Day gets done, I already know where the next book is going to start. I know where it's going to be set, and I have a rough idea in my head of what it's going to encompass. I think it's very much everything tends to be drawn fairly heavily from what's going on in the world. In terms of the Shadow Warrior series, it's also me trying to figure out kind of where is the next logical progression for Nichols. Because it is a very character-driven series, and the books really, they started out, particularly in Pandora's Grave, as being very much kind of the classic globe-trotting action hero, where there's all Nichols is in America, and then he's in Iran, and then he's in Israel, and so forth. He crosses continents quite freely in that book. But as the series has unfolded and he has lost his team, he is more of a lone wolf. He is much more constricted in his movements and where he might find himself, and crossing borders is a lot harder for him. And so I have to take those kind of considerations into play when determining, well, where is he going to be next? And despite the fact that he's going to have a somewhat novel form of transportation at the end of Soon Dies the Day, that still is somewhat of a constricting element. But I really try to look at, okay, where's the next story I want to tell? How can I kind of build up to that? Because some of the prequel shorter novels kind of foreshadow things. There's some definite foreshadowing in Wildcard, which was the last prequel Nichols novel I wrote and released last spring. If you read that book, you know a fair bit, whether you know that you know it or not, you know a fair bit about where the book after Soon Dies the Day is going to take place, and some of the people it will involve. So I like setting up things like that and kind of trying to bring together an organic world. One of the things I really have liked with the Shadow Warriors universe as I've continued to expand it with all these books, like you say, 11 titles. Soon Dies the Day will be 12. I've got the 2 titles of the Line of God trilogy that share the universe with the Shadow Warriors. The thing I really have enjoyed doing with those kind of interlocking series is creating this sense of personal history. Characters within the Shadow Warriors universe have histories with each other, and those histories impact how they interact and what they're willing to do for each other or to each other in some instances. And really trying to weave that all together has been to me one of the greater joys of writing in the genre and writing the series. Trying to pull all of that together.
Yeah. Do you outline? And if so, what does that look like? No outlines?
No, I probably need to stop that, given the way it's served me with this last book. But no, I don't.
Considering who you're talking to here, and I'm shocked by you saying that you don't outline at all. Even I outline somewhat.
I've described it to people over the years as very much my process for approaching a book is. It's kind of like this analogy means so much more to me now that I'm living in Montana than it ever did on the East Coast. But
okay.
It's like I'm standing on a mountain.
Yeah.
And I'm looking across a valley at another mountain, and I know I need to get to that mountain. I do not know how to get to that mountain, but I know it's there, and I try to keep it in view through the trees as I hack my way through the bush with machete or something. So yeah, and a lot of what I write, and then a lot of what gets me in trouble and means these books take longer to write than they should. A lot of what I write is trying to figure out the snowballing consequences of the actions as my characters work through toward the end. Because I try, and I'm sure sometimes succeed better than others, but I try not to force characters into doing things that they would not do. There was this scene there was a scene in Day of Reckoning that I often mentally turn to as an example of this, where it was toward the end of the book. There's a hostage situation in Las Vegas, and the president is involved trying to make sure this situation doesn't turn into an absolute fiasco, or at least any more of one than it already is. And there's a scene where Nichols is on the phone with the president on the other end. And when I first wrote that scene, because the president was basically ordering everyone to stand down, they were going to negotiate with the terrorists, so forth. And Nichols was not. He had reason to believe the negotiations were basically a fraud, and that they should go ahead and launch an assault to rescue the hostages. And in the first draft of that scene, I had him basically tell off the president. And then I realized, after I stepped back from that scene, that was not Nichols. I had inadvertently slipped into Jack Bauer mode when writing that scene.
Yeah.
And I'd written the scene the way Jack Bauer would do it, but I had not written the scene the way Nichols would do it. And so I went back and tore the scene apart, and I had some great dialogue that hit the cutting room floor because he wasn't going to say any of those things.
Yeah.
But what it turned out was that Nichols did what Nichols was going to do. He acquiesced to the president, hung up the phone, and went and did his own thing.
Yeah.
And it was very much more of the subtle approach of someone he's not flamboyant, he's not in your face. He's just, if he needs to do something underhanded, that's the way he's going to do it. And he'd probably prefer to do it that way rather than piss everybody off openly.
Right. So you're more George R.R. Martin has sort of, I don't know if he came up with this, but he sort of famously said that all, and you're snickering as soon as I bring up Martin. So you're George Martin has sort of he's described the writing process, outlining, I think in general, is more that all writers fall on a spectrum between the architect and the gardener, whereas the architect knows exactly where every little nail and board and light switch and everything is going to go before even a single thing gets done. Whereas a gardener sort of goes out and they go, I'm going to plant some tomatoes over here and some cucumbers over there. And, if sunflowers come up where you planted tomatoes, that's an issue, but you sort of see what comes up and how it works. And you kind of, find your way.
Yeah, and right now with Soon Dies the Day, I'm very much at the dear Lord, where did all these weeds come from stage of gardening. But yes.
Yeah. Yeah. Another way that I sort of like to look at it, because I outline somewhat, but I like to sort of keep it loose, because I feel like if I know exactly how everything's going to happen, I get bored by that. Would you say that too?
I would say, I'm not sure bored is the word I would use. I feel trapped. If I know how everything is supposed to go, and then it feels like I have to force it into those boxes,
right,
to make it work, then I feel trapped and feel like, what's going on here?
Right.
This isn't working. And I don't know. It's not to say I don't rate myself into some interesting boxes going about it the other way, but it seems more natural and free flowing that way.
Yeah. I've described that process as sort of like a road trip, that like they say, okay, you and me, we're going to get in the car and we're going to drive to California, right? So I have to know roughly what interstates we're going to take to get there, what hotels we're going to spend the night at, but I can't tell you before we go on this road trip, oh yeah, our car's going to break down in this state, and in New Mexico, we're going to meet this really weird guy in a bar somewhere, and all this stuff is going to happen to us. I can't tell you that because we haven't gone on the journey yet. And
right.
To me, that journey is writing the first draft.
Yeah. Yeah, I agree.
So okay, so you get a first draft done. How much would you say of that first draft makes it into what is eventually published, or how much gets rewritten or changed over the editing process?
Usually I would say the vast majority of it. I'm not entirely certain I'll be able to say that about Soon Dies the Day. It's okay. It's been its own beast, but usually by the time I'm done a first draft, I basically know where most stuff is going to go, unless something crops up in the edits that I realize that I botched something massively in the first third of the book and then forgot about it, or wrote something in the second the final third of the book that doesn't work because of something I forgot about early on in the story. Which I try to avoid those situations wherever possible.
Yeah.
But unless something like that happens, generally the story remains mostly the same. I don't cut massively, and I don't think there's definitely been parts in my books where I've cut out plot points that didn't work or something, but that often gets done in a mid-book panic of this is not working, tear it all apart and put it back together, and then I proceed with the first draft. So yeah, normally by the time I'm actually ready to do what most people would say is the editing phase, the story as a whole is fairly the way it's going to be. There's not usually too many massive shifts there.
Have you worked with other editors for
I have
your
not,
projects?
No.
Yeah. Okay. Any particular reason? Just prefer to keep it in-house, or have you considered that at some point?
I have considered that. I think at this point I prefer to keep it in-house. It's something I may change my mind on in the future, but yeah, at the moment it's something that's worked for me and so forth. So
yeah. So beta readers, I know you have thankfully quite a loyal stable of beta readers who check out your work before it gets published. I'm sure as few are going to be listening to this. What do you, when you get feedback early on before the book is out, what do you really look for? What do you hope to hear? What's most valuable to you?
Well, I hope to hear that it's a fantastic book that's better than all my previous books, but no, I have developed a really great team over the years, deeply indebted to them. They great group of people, but I'm often looking for what I hear from more than one person, interestingly enough, because there's been some times when I'll think I remember one particular scene in Lodestone where I had something I just absolutely loved, and I thought it was so clever, and I heard from, I think I had like 7 or 8 people on the team at that point in time, and I'm pretty certain I heard from like 60% of them on that being an issue, and I'm like, okay, I apparently was not as clever as I thought I was. All right, well, there we go.
Kill your darlings.
Yeah, I'm a little less inclined to go take to the chopping block something that maybe just 1 or 2 people mention, but once it starts reaching a critical mass, I'm like, okay, I've made a serious mistake here. It's time to reconsider my own outlook on this and just deal with it. So yeah, I like seeing what people respond to in the story. I mean, how do different people provide you with different levels of detail in their feedback, but I've always really interested to see what people respond to, what characters resonate with them, beyond the protagonist, because, I mean, if you've done your job even halfway well, people are going to respond to your protagonist, but how does the supporting cast strike them? How do they respond to the people that kind of come in and out of the story, or play more minor roles? I remember feedback a number of years ago with the character of Stephen Flaherty and Embrace the Fire, and I got feedback on him that just completely matched everything I felt about that character, but hadn't actually put on the page. And that was just a priceless golden moment to me of, okay, he's hitting exactly the way he's meant to hit, and they're reading the subtext exactly the way it's meant to be read.
Uh-huh.
And that stuff, that's when you just kind of sit back and you're like, this is why I enjoy being a writer.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Those moments are always great.
But yeah, it's really seeing how things hit people. Are they landing the way they were intended to land? And if not, then you've got to go back to the chopping block again and sort it all out.
Right. Would you say that the Shadow Warrior series is primarily the journey of Harry Nichols?
I would say in large part, yes. Certainly the main books are.
Uh-huh.
Yeah, I would say they're very much kind of his journey from, like I mentioned earlier, very much being a bit of very much a team leader, very much a team player in the CIA, to very much being a lone wolf. And it's interesting because going back and writing some of the prequel novels, I've taken a little bit of I think at least it's a little bit of an unconventional approach, because Harry, like most protagonists in this genre, has his own battles with bureaucrats, and there's some people in the CIA bureaucracy who really do not like him and don't like his approach. They don't like the way he kind of tries to engender personal loyalty in his team. And there are a number of times in the earlier books where they have some very pointed comments to make about Nichols. What's interesting about that, because on its surface, it's just kind of the normal bureaucracy, field ops divide that you see so commonly in the genre. But if you look very closely at some of what they're saying, the later books actually do bear them out.
Uh-huh.
It's not all just sour grapes or these people who are trapped behind a desk and don't understand the reality of field work and so forth. They are actually pointing to fairly legitimate flaws in Nichols' character that do play out in later books with significant consequences to everyone involved. And I like that kind of I like that way of kind of bringing that in a way that's familiar and yet doing it in a way that's very different to the way that generally comes across in the genre, as just kind of baseless accusations. And with Nichols' case, they're not baseless.
Right. Right. Do you have an end in mind for the Shadow Warrior series and for Nichols' journey?
Not hard and fast. No, I know where the next few books are going, but no, I do not have a concrete sense of the end. So time will tell.
Yeah, is this something that you think you sort of want to keep it going on as long as you can, or would you eventually like to get to some end?
I think at this point, keep it going. We'll see how I'm feeling about that 3 or 4 or 5 or more books down the line.
Right.
But I think I'll keep it going for quite a while to come. So I definitely have ideas for quite a few more books in the series. So
That's good. That's good. Keep it coming for a while. I mean, so you are, I think, frankly, one of the most well-read people that I know. I mean, seeing your surveys of the classics and ancient history that you've done over the years is something that you just really don't see people do anymore. And, I know you and I are both big fans of George Martin and his work. Do you think it's important to sort of, if you're writing in this genre, to sort of read extensively outside of it, especially through the classics and history? And what has that brought into your writing?
I think it can be. I don't know that I would say it's essential, but I think you definitely get aspects of kind of a way of looking at things that you wouldn't get otherwise. I remember, I think it was one of our conversations, probably over lunch a couple years ago, when I commented about Presence of Mine Enemies, and I said, well, I've been reading Greek tragedies all summer, and readers are going to understand the impact that's had when they read this book. So I think definitely there's a way in which kind of stepping out of the modern world and the modern way of looking at things can lend itself toward trying to develop characters that you're able to portray different points of view with, I think, a little more validity, or at least in a way that's more interesting, if you've kind of brought yourself out of your own comfort zone and read widely. And then there's just all the little details that you find yourself coming across, and you're just like, oh, I never would have thought about this. There's one example, which I trust this won't be too graphic for this podcast, but there's one example in Windbreak. There's a scene. Windbreak takes place in the Philippines, and there's a hostage situation with American missionaries who are taken hostage by Islamic State affiliated militants in the Southern Islands.
Yeah.
And there's a scene late in the book when one of the hostages, one of the Filipinos that's taken prisoner along with the American missionaries, is beheaded by the ISIS militants. And it had never occurred to me, because I am a sheltered Westerner who's never thought through something like this. It never occurred to me the mechanics of, well, okay, now you've got a head there.
Yeah.
And what if the person doesn't have long hair? Well, how do you go about picking that up?
Yeah.
And I was led to think about this, and then to end up writing it a certain way in the story, because about 6 months before, I had been reading through, I think it was Tacitus, I'm not entirely certain, but The Year of the Three Emperors. I'm forgetting the name because I do not actually retain everything I read. But one of the emperors in The Year of the Three Emperors was rather old and completely bald. And I believe it is Tacitus that records that they had significant issues with his head once it was separated from his body.
It's when you stick it onto something.
That might be what they ended up doing with it. But just that thought of what happens here is not something you would pick up in most ordinary reading, and I certainly would be personally happy to never encounter it again, because it was a fairly gruesome moment, even as in Tacitus's very sterile retelling of it. But it's one of those things that you don't think about it because it's not part of your world. Well, then you go read a lot of history, and you're like, okay, well, but for some people this is a part of their world, and they share details that you wouldn't cross your mind otherwise.
Yeah. Yeah. Always a fun day when you start Googling the inner mechanics of beheading someone. But I guess that's the business that we're in.
Fortunately, I don't think I've ever had to do that specifically, but yes.
It's not fun, let me tell you. When you really start considering stuff, it's like, it's let me get this scene done with and move on. It's the type of stuff that can keep you up at night. Yes.
Then we pass those things on to our readers because we love them.
Yeah, I mean, I think they should know what they're getting into. I don't pretend that this is, some lighthearted romp.
Right, and I do think there's a level at which, and this may play into something you're going to talk about later, but I do think there's a level at which I don't like indulging in the blood just for the shock value of it. I don't have a lot of fondness for that.
Uh-huh.
And yet we are writing about a very serious topic that has claimed a lot of lives in a lot of very gruesome ways in just the last 10 years, and still does to this day. I mean, the Taliban retaking Afghanistan has been no picnic for anyone involved. So I think there is a responsibility to delve into it in enough of a way to say, okay, this isn't the A team where people get shot and no one dies. This is real. This is real life, and the consequences are real.
Yeah. Well, I think that's a good segue. Maybe we should get into it, which is, the ethics of writing in this genre. This is something that I've wanted to have someone on here to really talk about since I really got involved with the podcast.
Yeah.
In an earlier episode, I was talking to Chris and about, the example of people using a scene from 24, like, okay, there's a nuke in Los Angeles that's going to go off in an hour. And, wouldn't you torture someone in that sort of situation? And that example from a fictional TV show being used to sort of justify real world policies, And so I look at that and I think about a lot of people who read books like the stuff that you and I write. It's the most extensive look at international relations and the military and geopolitics that they'll ever get. And I think we can easily do them a disservice by projecting these issues, these very complex, nuanced geopolitical issues involving ancient cultures and religions so much older than our own, as something very simple that, this action hero kind of character with a Glock and a few pounds of C4 can go off and solve. And people read some of these books and they think, well, why can't someone just go clip Putin in the Kremlin? Why can't we just send someone to do that and just end the war? And I think there's real responsibility that we have to show the world for as gray and complicated and just messed up as it actually is. How do you feel about that?
Yeah, I think that there's a lot of truth to that. I mean, yeah, why don't we just assassinate Putin and the war in Ukraine's over with? Well, there's probably 3 or 4 or 5 or 12 dozen people as bad or Putin or worse than Putin in the Russian leadership. And yeah, I mean, I carry no water for Vladimir Putin, but he's not the worst man in Russia. And
no, he's not.
And getting rid of him likely doesn't actually change anything for the better. And so, yeah, not everything can be handled. I mean, the old joke about it, when all you've got is a hammer, everything looks like a nail. Well, not everything actually can be handled that way.
Yeah.
And a lot of times you find yourself not really understanding what you're getting into or the likely outcome of it. I mean, it's something we've understood increasingly. The more we learned about Iraq and Afghanistan, you read countless accounts of scenarios in which we went in, we did something that would, at least on the face of it, have not seemed too far outside the box for our genre, a direct action raid. We went in, we got the bad guys, we killed them, we put them down, whatever. And 2 months later, we figured out that the person that had been reported to us by the trusted local sources, because these were the bad guys and they were affiliated with Al-Qaeda, there was actually this long-standing clan grudge going back like 2, 3, 4, 5 generations, and they took advantage of us to get rid of their rival. And that's just one small example and very localized example of how things can start going completely wrong with, as I said before, the best of intentions.
Yeah.
I mean, sure, you want to go kick down doors and handcuff bad guys, but you may well find yourself in a situation where you don't even know quite what you're getting into or who the bad guys are. And that's, I think, one thing that this genre struggles with. And I'm not even sure I've found too much of a way to get around it, because the book has to happen, and not to be too blunt about it.
Yeah.
But the genre very much falls into the trap of, we have this intelligence is right, this is now going to happen. And in the real world, it is just so much murkier, and it takes so much more time, and even the best of authors really struggle to portray that. I thought one author who's done it far better than most, largely as a result of his own experiences in Afghanistan, is Matthew Criscio. His novel Security Day is fantastic, and really a great look at a situation where the alliances are muddled and murky, and there is just no real good outcome. But by and large, the genre struggles with that uncertainty. We want to know that the ticking bomb is where the intel says the ticking bomb says it is, because we want to move on to the scene where they defuse the ticking bomb with 5 seconds left on the very visible clock.
Right.
And we struggle with the randomness of, well, the bomb isn't where they said it is, and it blows up in a crowded market 5 blocks over while we're searching the empty house. That's the sort of stuff that I think it comes back to, in some ways, a novel has to make sense. The real world has no obligation to make sense, and typically doesn't. And I think getting that randomness into a fictional narrative that nevertheless has to cohere in some sense is difficult. And yet, we do have some obligation to not fall into the CSI trap, where you have people on juries acting in ways that are just like, well, we can't convict this guy because the evidence isn't up to the level of the evidence I saw on the TV show last night. I mean,
right.
It's just there's very much a similar dynamic at work in this genre, in the sense of how people have viewed the real world. And you see that particularly in the genre. I spoke earlier that a lot of this genre either falls into the camp of American patriotic superhero or evil government conspiracy. You see a lot of that impact as well, because in the novel, people in the novel, there's these great sweeping conspiracies that all manage to stay amazingly secret until the lone insightful hero picks up on it. And the government leaks like a sieve. If there were such conspiracies, they'd be on the front page of the New York Times the following day. It's just the government doesn't do a good job of keeping things secret when it's trying very, very hard. And I think that's one aspect in which the genre has really done the real world a disservice, in projecting that sense of how easy it is to keep secrets, to cover things up. I mean, to take just one real world example, the Israelis have more experience in the direct action, assassination, targeted killing field than probably pretty much any government on the face of the earth, and probably more than most of them combined. Particularly if you're thinking of actually doing it with human agents and not like doing it from a drone. And yet, it was a few years ago, the Mossad takes out a guy, and I think it was it Dubai? I'm trying to recall the details now.
Yeah, it's Dubai.
Yeah, and their guys get flagged not long after they get out of the country, and it goes all over.
Their passports were bad, I think.
Yeah, exactly. But I'm just, you look at a story like that, and you're like, okay, we dumb a lot of this down for the genre, and because we have to, because it quite frankly wouldn't be fun if we didn't. But one of the things it leads to is people thinking that this stuff is really easy, and well, of course you just do this because that's the easiest thing to do. Where in the real world, a government that's had decades of practice at this thing still doesn't manage to keep it under wraps in what, by the stakes of the genre, would be a very low-stakes killing.
Yeah, that's nothing. Yeah, that's like a scene.
Yeah, it's scene and you move on with the rest of the book. But in that case, it was something that just completely unraveled till people were in serious hot water. I think something similar happened with the CIA. Trying to think how many years ago that was, but Italy, rendition flight got in all kinds of hot water.
People got charged for that.
Yeah, and it's just another classic example of something that in a book would go completely flawlessly, but in real life, the sand got in the gears, and it ended badly for everyone involved.
Yeah. So you were most of your books in this series so far have been kind of really kind of focused on the global war on terror, and a lot of those sort of interstitial issues around it. We've talked in the past, you and I, about how it's sort of moving more into the world of great power politics, Russia, China, India, perhaps a climate crisis. What sort of interests you about exploring those topics?
Well, I think it's something that's definitely dominated more and more of the public attention in the last half decade or so. I think to some extent people find themselves gravitating toward different enemies because we kind of want an enemy that's more competent, let's say, than the average jihadist cell. Though, as I delved into with Wildcard, incompetent terrorists can be fun to write about too, because sometimes they don't have to be all that competent to come scarily close to actually succeeding. But I think there's a measure of that. I think that motivation's probably been undercut a little bit by the last year with the revelation that the Russian military isn't quite the 12-foot tall tiger that's sometimes been made out to be in the genre. Which is not to say that some of their special ops units aren't still a credible threat by all means,
right.
But it's I think it's something that I've been interested in, and it's something I've explored in Presence of Mine Enemies, and then in Soon Dies the Day, where you see great power competition very much interfacing with the war on terror, and you see groups getting funded from interesting places. You see active measures, not to borrow the name of your own book, but you see active measures taking a hand in ways that wouldn't be obvious to most people on the surface as, okay, this is the group involved here. And so I think I've been interested in it in that sense. I don't think I'll ever be moving on to a sense of writing about tank divisions clashing with each other. But I very much find the interplay of traditional intelligence services in the mix quite fascinating. And sometimes, as I get into with Soon Dies the Day, sometimes very competing intelligence services. I describe Russian intelligence in Soon Dies the Day. I'm trying to remember the quote now. It's many chapters back, but something I describe it as a fratricidal system where the right hand only knows what the left hand is doing by dint of 24 hours surveillance.
That's fair.
And so kind of portraying that sense of where it's not just different national intelligence services competing, but it's also even, in some countries, it's even a very fratricidal relationship between the various entities within the country. Can be quite interesting to explore and delve into.
Yeah, very interesting. We have talked a bit about, you and I just offline, about, the issue of AI, artificial intelligence, chatbots being used to essentially ghostwrite, scenes or whole chapters from novels, with plugging in a few little details and stuff. What do you think of that? How do you see that being, a thing at all?
I hesitate to dismiss it out of hand because, like most technology, it's going to get better.
Yeah.
What I've seen of it to date, I don't think there's anything to worry about too much in the near term. It's people are, as I made a comment to someone a few weeks back. Right now, people are not suffering from a lack of reading material.
Yeah,
they're suffering from a lack of good reading material, and I think the AI is going to have to develop a lot before it can actually compete with better authors in the genre. There's definitely probably going to be some people who are leaning very hard into just kind of writing everything according to the tropes and rushing it out the door to make a quick buck, which I really want to tell them that if making a quick buck is their goal in life, being an author is really doing it on hard mode. I mean, if your goal in life is just to make money, you can do that so many ways, so much easier than writing books.
Start a crypto scheme.
Yeah, yeah, but yeah, I don't see that there's a lot of need to worry just yet. That might change, but
Right.
at this point, I don't think I think when we had this conversation offline, my comment to you was that if they come up with an AI that's as evil as you or I, we'll have bigger problems than what's happening with the fiction market.
Yeah, that'll be an issue. Yeah, I think our little books will really matter at that point. So when we were talking last night, I mentioned that I had a surprise for you.
Yeah.
So along that line of AI, I asked ChatGPT, an AI bot, I queried it. I said, please write a scene from a spy thriller novel in the style of Stephen England. You want to hear what it said?
Oh, goodness.
Okay, you ready for this? All right.
All right,
okay.
Go for it.
Here we go. I'll read it for you. Logan crouched in the shadows, watching the target through his night vision goggles. He was perched on a rooftop overlooking a heavily guarded compound, waiting for the signal to strike. His mission was simple: infiltrate the compound, extract the high-value target, and get out before anyone knew what had happened. But as Logan surveyed the scene below, he knew it was going to be anything but simple. The compound was surrounded by high walls and razor wire, with armed guards stationed at every entrance. There were even rumors of an elite private security force patrolling the perimeter, armed with state-of-the-art weapons and equipment. But Logan was a shadow warrior, and he had faced tougher challenges before. He took a deep breath and focused on the task at hand. The signal came in over his earpiece, and Logan sprang into action. He darted across the rooftop, leaping from one building to the next with practiced ease. He landed on the edge of the compound wall and used his grappling hook to scale it. As he reached the top, Logan spotted a guard patrolling the wall. He waited until the guard was facing away, then dropped down behind him and took him out with a swift, silent strike. Logan slipped over the wall and made his way towards the target's location, moving quickly and quietly. He took out guards with lethal precision, each strike executed with cold, calculated efficiency. Finally, he reached the target's cell. The door was heavily reinforced, but Logan was prepared for that. He produced a small device from his pocket. Notice it doesn't say what the device was. A small device from his pocket and attached it to the lock.
There's no branding there. That's disappointing.
No. How do you sell hatchets and AR-15 accessories if you're not going to go into it? With a few taps on his keypad, the lock disengaged. Logan slipped inside and found the target. It was a man, bound and gagged but alive. Logan released him and helped him to his feet. "Let's get out of here," Logan said, and they made their way back towards the wall. But as they approached, Logan heard the sound of approaching footsteps. He turned to face the sound and saw the squad of elite security guards advancing towards them, weapons at the ready. Logan grinned. This was going to be fun. So what do you think, Stephen? Are your timbers shivered? Are you going to hang up the cape?
Maybe not quite yet, but yeah, we might need to be worried.
I don't know.
I really do wonder though, because there were a couple things in there that kind of sounded like something I might write, but then the whole ending with "this is gonna be fun," yeah, I'd never write that. So
no,
I don't know. I think it needs a little more work.
I don't know. I think it reads to me like it almost reads like a montage, like there's no detail, there's no soul, there's no life, there's no nothing. It's just very like paint by numbers, which with a lot of people, I mean, yeah, I guess that's what matters,
It's that excerpt, and a lot of the others I've encountered are very much this happened, and this happened, and this happened, and this happened, and there's not a lot of meat, or as you say, soul to how it happens or why or any of the details there. Well, I'm sure it'll work on it a little bit more, but
yeah, I mean it'll get better, but for now I'm not concerned. One thing I thought about this though, for this scene that I just read, who owns the copyright to that?
Exactly. Yeah.
I didn't write it, I prompted it, but do the developers behind this chatbot, do they own it? Like how does that work?
I don't really know the details of it, and I've seen several other people raise this issue as well. Like there's a historian blogger I follow. He posts about different military and history aspects. Has great. I believe his name's Brett Devereaux. Has some great blog posts on The Lord of the Rings, Rings of Power, analyzing them from a military historian point of view. And someone had done like a Chat GPT, write me an essay on the Roman legions in the style of Brett Devereaux, and he raised the question. I mean, he thought it was kind of entertaining, but he raised the question there of, okay, there's definitely some things in here that have been trawled from my site. How do the permissions work of that? I mean,
exactly.
He hadn't given license for that stuff to be used. Now, who knows? Maybe we'll find that we all agreed to it back in some TOS we clicked through without reading it all. But
right,
it does raise a lot of very interesting legal questions, both on the output end and on the input end. Really.
Yeah, I mean, if you assembled a novel with scenes like this, and I'm sure someone has already done it, and you release it, do they own the copyright? I don't know that they do.
It would be very interesting to see that go to court and be challenged. I don't know enough about it to speculate, but it would be fascinating to see.
All right. Well, coming up, last couple things here. If you had, I'm sure there's someone listening who, they've been reading spy fiction for a long time, and maybe they're retired or they're just sort of getting into it. They're young like we are, and they want to start it. What advice would you have for an aspiring writer looking to get into this genre?
I would say read the genre voraciously, learn what works, what doesn't. It's not going to, I mean, being an avid reader of the genre won't make you a good writer of it, but you'll be hard pressed to become a good writer of it without doing that, as one of the steps at least. Yeah. And then I'd say just practice. I mean, those first attempts, my attempts, probably your attempts too, were like Etch a Sketch. It was trying to imitate what you've seen done, and it just it was a mess. But you learn the mechanics of things that way. And you learn how to kind of break things down and approach things and say, okay, well, it was done this way, and this author I like, and I could do it differently. And you start playing with it and seeing what's possible. And I think there's probably some easier ways to go about that. I mean, I'm not going to tell anyone that they can't learn through creative writing courses or other helps. But I think at some point it all does come down to you've got to put in the time trying. Yeah. And it doesn't matter how many helps you use or how many shortcuts you take, you still got to come back down, sit in front of the computer and hammer it out and be self-critical enough to know when to throw it away. There's really just no substitute for that work.
Yeah. Anything else you'd like to cover that we haven't gotten to?
So I think we touched briefly earlier on Soon Dies the Day, and we were talking a little bit about the backdrop of that. So that story is an interesting one, because the core premise of Soon Dies the Day as it exists today is it centers around what's essentially a fairly elaborate coup attempt in Germany, put on by German ultranationalists. And what's been kind of ironic and troubling and annoying, because sometimes real life annoys you writing this genre, is that Germany has had 2 coup attempts since I started writing the book. Or should I say more like coup plots. They never got to the point of attempts.
They got coup curious. That's a tongue twister for you.
Okay, yes, they were very coup. Yeah,
right.
Anyway, that's a tongue twister too. Coup curious. But to the point where in 2020, Germany disbanded a significant portion of their army's elite commando unit, the KSK, because they were found to have some disturbingly dangerous political tendencies and had been involved in working their way toward plotting a coup. Then there was the more hilarious one than this past year, late December, I think it was, where there was another plot uncovered to actually put a figure of German royalty that no one knew even existed on the throne of Germany.
Yeah.
And I found myself kind of a little bit sad that I hadn't gone that route with the book, because that's one of those things that would have seemed way too bizarro land to do, but such is the world we live in. Fiction has to make sense, the real world doesn't. But what the interesting thing is of Soon Dies the Day is that it has been in, not only has it taken way too long to write, it's not the first time I've written it. Because this story actually started way back in 2008 for me. And it was the first Shadow Warriors book that I ever actually got to book length. I think it ended up like 450 pages or so. And that was really the book that, to tie back into our earlier discussion of my process and how things kind of came to be, that was really the book that proved to me that Shadow Warriors could be a thing. It wasn't going to just... It was really the first book that exploded past that 110, 115 page mark and just took over. And it was a very elaborate plot. It was mostly set in Germany, involving basically German neo-Nazis. And at that point in time, it was very much more the kind of the Clive Cussler type, Indiana Jones type connection of neo-Nazis, and a very different story than it's been on the rewrite. That was really the book that sent me back to the drawing boards of, okay, I've got this book, but it isn't an origin story for Nichols. Where do I begin? So I started on the road that ultimately led me to Pandora's Grave. And really ever since then, ever since 2008, I've been trying to work my way back to this book.
Uh-huh.
And yet, by the time I got here, when I wrote finished Presence of My Enemies a few years ago, by the time I got here, I had known for some years that, okay, that book was perfectly fine and acceptable when I was 18, and it was really the first book I looked at and like, okay, that's done, that's good, I'm not going to throw that away. But the series has changed, my vision for the series has changed, my writing style has changed dramatically in the last 15 years. Phew. Anyway, not wanting to think about how long 2008 was, how long ago 2008 was. But so I really had to go back and start from scratch. There was a World War II connection in the original story that I would love to explore in a book in the future. I think it would be really cool to do.
Yeah.
But it was not going to fit with the tone of the series, and it took me a good while to decide to chop it out, but I ultimately chopped it out. Just like, that doesn't work anymore, and really had to redesign the book pretty much entirely from there. There's not a lot of the original book left other than the German setting and the nationalist connection there. But that really... and then, of course, now that I'm actually back there, the German nationalist right is doing things that they weren't even dreaming of doing in 2008. So it's been an interesting journey in that regard. I'm hoping it will be done here, maybe even this week. I'll tempt fate by saying that. That could be another 3-day literary operation that takes me till summer.
It's a special literary operation. Let's call it that.
Yes, exactly. But yeah, it's been an interesting journey and interesting to kind of watch the world change. Certainly changed dramatically since I first wrote that story back in 2007, 2008. And then even as watching it change as I'm rewriting it in these years. I mean, the original story didn't involve a coup plot. I quickly worked my way around to that as I started designing the rewrite. But then, okay, here's 2 actual coup plots, and what are the odds of that happening? So yeah, it's been an interesting process. But I've been I've been pleased to work through it and hopefully get it done and get it through editing here very soon, and
Nice.
get it out to my readers who have been waiting far too long for it. So
I think it'll be a good example of what we were saying, the ethics in this genre of showing the world for how it is and not just how we and our readers might want it to be.
Yeah. I think it's been an interesting process in that, because I always approach a story and say, okay, I know what I want to do here. I have a fairly good grasp of the subject, and then I start reading it. I start reading and researching, and I say, I didn't know the first thing about this subject, and so each book is very much an education for me, and in trying to learn how all the nuances of things come together and can hopefully be instilled or distilled into an exciting story. So
yeah, very nice. Well, I think you and I could easily go for another hour or two. We'll have to have you back on when Soon Dies the Day comes out.
Sounds like a plan, Matt. I appreciate this.
Yeah.
It's been a fun conversation.
Stephen, where can listeners find more about you and your work?
Amazon's the best place. Just search for my name and search for my books, and you'll find pretty much all of them.
Sure. All right. Well, I hope they certainly do that. Stephen England, thank you so much.
All righty. Thank you so much, Matt. Have a good one.
Thanks for listening. This is Secrets and Spies.